Hey folks, Andrew here at All Things I Am. So I'm gonna take a little bit of a different approach today, and I'm actually gonna use some PowerPoint slides to really drive the message of what ABAC is. I feel like it's just much more easier to visually show everybody what ABAC is rather than you looking at a camera and seeing me talk about ABAC because I don't think it really drives the message very well. So let's begin. So RBAC is a common authorization method today that we use to get roles. We use the 80-20 rule or some other method, top-down or bottom analysis, to figure out what are those common access. The problem is, like I said earlier in my intro, is what if we really need to dial down to particular areas of a location? And that's where we have ABAC, and we can use this as to really say, hey, you know what? I want to be more specific in how I grant access to people and look at more different attributes. And that's kind of where ABAC brings into play. So I'm gonna break this down into a couple areas. The first thing about ABAC, I'm gonna talk about what is ABAC. And then once I break that down, we're gonna talk about when is the best way to implement ABAC and how it works. Like what's the engine that drives it? Then I'm gonna talk about the pros and cons of ABAC, and finally just give you a quick summary of what's going on. Because again, you're gonna get a lot of information at one time, and summarizations are always great to really make sure you get the full picture or at least the big highlights of it. So let's talk about what is ABAC. So when you look at ABAC today, and this is the definition of ABAC, and I know it's long, and it's really it's an access control method where subjects' requests to perform operations on objects are granted or denied based on assigned attributes of a subject, assigned attributes of an object, environment conditions, and a set of policies that are specific in terms of attributes and conditions. Yeah, I just read that whole definition for you, which is on the screen, but I really want to just drive that message because this came from NIST, but what I really want you to focus on is that highlighted attributes and really what does that really mean? So when we look at attributes, what we're looking at is this. So as defined by NIST, attributes are characteristics of a subject, an object, or an environmental conditions. And you're saying going, well, what is that? Think of it as this. They could be a person, their job title, maybe what their clearance level is. And for those who aren't aware, it's really more for the federal government where you have clearance levels. What is their IP address, which is in environment conditions? These are this and some other attributes is really what that really means. Those makeup and models that really describe the individual or the bot or whatever that you want to really say, I want to take all this to account first before I really say yes or no about giving someone or something access to a location, an area, a file, and so on. So let's break that down just a little bit more. So what's a subject? When you think of a subject, I want you to think of it as a human user or this friendly guy here, a bot, or what we like to call a non-person entity or an NPE. And people are very easy. You obviously know the attributes like I said earlier, job title, name, first name, last name, date of birth, whatever you want to describe a person. Bots are interesting if you think about it. So bots can do human actions, but automatically. And the easiest way for you to understand bots is when you go to a website and you get that little pop-up button, the live chat, you're not really talking to a live person. You're talking to a bot for the most part. And they'll ask you some common questions saying, hey, what's your order, for example, or how can I help you? And then based on your responses, and it drives you to the next set of questions to get you the answer you want to do. So it saves a lot of time for the most part. I know you and I have all been there where we even called like Verizon, for example, and you get a bot and it's just so frustrating. And you're like, human. And that happens from time to time, but that's really what a bot is. So those are really what your subjects are when you look at the whole equation of ABAC. So the next part of ABAC is objects. And you're like, what's an object? So when you think of an object, you can think of a couple things. You can think of a file, for example. You can think of a machine or a device. And the third thing is you can think of like a database, for example, or even it's even some kind of form of a database or the table itself. And there are some other parts that I haven't listed in here, such as an object could also be a network, even a program, like a software program, for example. These are what we like to call objects. And that really describes it. So you have your subject, Now you have your object. And then the other part I want to talk about is an operation. So when you think of an operation, it's very straightforward. It could be rights. So you have read rights, you have write rights, you have delete, for example. These are some common ones today. Copy, execute, modify. These are all operations. So we have a subject, we have an object, and now we have what's the operation that you're trying to intend to do. And then another part of ABAC is you want to talk about your policies. And a policy is where you have a representation of rules or a relationship that makes the ABAC system really work. And it looks at the policy to say, what is the decision I am making based on some rules? It takes into account a couple things. Number one, like I said earlier, it takes into account the subject. If it's a person, the various attributes that make a person, an MPE, for example. That's the first part of policy to take a look at. And then it takes a look at the object. What are you trying to grant to? What's the access you're trying to get to? And that's really what that is. So policy takes into account the subject and then the object. What are you trying to get access to? And based on those criteria of the attributes of a subject and the object you're trying to get access to, it's going to put them together and make a decision. If you qualify or you meet the criteria, then you're going to get a positive access and you're going to get grant access to wherever you want to get to. But if for some odd reason you don't meet that criteria, then your access gets denied. So pretty much think of a policy as your engine or your decision maker to make those decisions based on the attributes you're feeding it. And then one last thing I want to talk about that I briefly talked over is environmental conditions. What is that? So environmental conditions could be a couple things. You can think about it could be time of day, where basically when you request your access, maybe there's a policy, maybe within the policy, there's rules saying, hey, only between these times or days you can request or get this access. If it doesn't fall within that range, then access is denied. Another environment condition is location. Where are you requesting this from? Like, for example, your IP address. If I'm based out of, let's say, Maryland, for example, and all of a sudden I am there 10 minutes ago, and then I get a request from, let's say, in California, 10 minutes later, you're like, wait a minute, that's just weird. Why should I do that? So in the policy, you might have, maybe a set of approved lists of locations or IP addresses saying that, hey, it must come from here, or maybe it must come from the United States, for example. And if it comes from another area or another country, deny. And then the third part is risk level. So how risky is the object that you're trying to access to? Is it something that's low level sensitive or something that's very top secret? And based on those conditions, when you request access again, maybe you get it, maybe you don't. Depends on the attributes that you're pushing to say, hey, policy, make a decision. So that's really in a nutshell, all the different things they have there. So that's about what is ABAC. Now let's talk about when do you want to use or when do you want to implement ABAC? So we talked about RBAC and we talked about the common use cases of RBAC. Again, what you want to do is you have all this different access. So you have your Office 365 access, Workday, some shared folder, a VPN access today. You realize that 80% of people have these access today. I'm going to make it into a role. And you'll see here is the role is assigned to a user. And that's great. And that works. But what if within that shared folder, I want to only restrict different locations within that folder? And with RBAC, I can't do that. With RBAC, I give you the whole folder. If there are some files or directories in that folder that is not really for your consumption, or you don't have the highest level of access, or your clearance level is low, I can't stop you from getting that file. I can't stop you from copying it. I can't stop you from saving it, deleting it, and sharing it. And that's a problem. And that's where RBAC really falls flat on its face. And that's where we talk about, if that's the issue, which I talked about again here, and I kind of jumped ahead of myself, is that right there where I can't restrict there. This is where ABAC comes in play, saying, you know what? We have sensitive information. We have access that we really want to be more specific or restrictive on. And that's where we implement ABAC. So I took this from NIST 800-162, and this is a great, easy, simple scenario that I want to really help drive how ABAC really works, the whole engine. So let's say our subject here, we'll call him Joe. Joe wants access to a database, and when he requests access to the system, the ABAC system or decision maker will look at the policy, which is 2A, and say, well, I have these rules in play, Joe. Let me make sure you qualify before I give you access to that database. So the access control policy, or the policy itself, will look at the attributes of Joe's attributes, and also the attributes of the object, which is the database that he's trying to access. And it looks at that and says, hey, here are the rules that I have in my policy. So within that policy, maybe it says you can only get access Monday through Friday from the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Eastern time, which is a environmental condition. Then also it says, you know what? Anybody requesting access, okay, you have a particular set of clearance levels for you to get that access. So once we look at everything right there, then we make a decision. So we look at Joe again. So Joe, he meets your criteria, but maybe he has a low level clearance. And then the policy itself says, okay, now I have a particular rule within my policy that says, if you meet this criteria, maybe I only give you read access, and that's what Joe gets, is that read access. But Joe will not get the ability to copy, edit, or delete something. And those are the operations right there that the ABAC engine can really dictate and drive. Where in RBAC, for example, I give Joe a role, and if Joe has access to this database here, he gets access to everything within the database, which is a problem, especially again, if there are particular files, directories, or he shouldn't be able to delete, copy, or manipulate the database tables itself. And that right there is how the ABAC engine works. There are more complex scenarios out there, and in the NIST, and I will link this in the description below, this actual artifact. It's a great read if you want to look into it. There are some other great more figures like this one that it's really complex. I'm like, I am going to bother to show that to you because I want to be very specific and just simply give you what ABAC really is. So now that we understand when to use RBAC, when to use ABAC and the best approach, what are the pros and cons of ABAC? So when you look at ABAC, it's an advanced model. So there are particular things that it does great. And the first thing that ABAC does amazing to you in terms of pros, it's fine-grained access control. It uses a various amounts of data or attributes to say, hey, if you meet this criteria, I'm going to give you access. Where in RBAC, it's coarse-grained, or it's more 80-20, where if access to a role, then I'll give it to you, but I can't restrict you within that access of that system or the application itself. Where in ABAC, it's fine-grained, so I can be very, very, very particular in what I want from you in terms of attributes before I grant you access. And then when I grant you that access, maybe I can restrict you a little further and saying you can only read and write, but you can't delete or copy. That's the beauty of ABAC and fine-grained access control. The second part is it's scalable. So when you look at it, you really are just updating policies. If you want to extend this to, if you have a huge organization, very well, easily scalable, versus RBAC, where you're sitting there and you're just creating more and more roles. And that can be cumbersome. Where in ABAC, you're just taking a couple of policies and maybe you're updating it. And I'm being very simple, high level, and there are more and more particular different scenarios as you expand or scale up. But I want to keep it simple here and tell you that it's much more easier to scale enterprise-wide versus RBAC. And then the last part, like I said earlier, is if you make a change. So let's talk about RBAC quickly. You make a change in RBAC, you're not changing something with the person. You're changing a role, and most of the time, you're just creating more and more roles. So if something should change, for example, saying, oh, I want to add X, Y, and Z application or more particular things, or something changes, I'm just creating more and more roles, and that leads to role explosion, which happens far often than none. Where in here in ABAC, you're taking the policy and you're just updating the policy. Maybe I have more rules. Maybe I have more rules to specifically dictate. Maybe I put some more environmental controls on there. All these different things, and you're not changing anything. All you're changing is the policy itself, but you're not recreating another policy. So it's not policy 1A, 1B. It's policy 1A, and then you're updating a rule, or you're updating particular criteria within that policy itself, but the policy stays the same, or the policy name itself stays as is, which is nice because that just makes it much more easier, and it's easier to be managed from that standpoint. 3 things that are pros, but obviously there are some cons when it comes to ABAC that we should be talking about. So the first thing is the initial setup of ABAC is so time consuming. It takes so much effort to get it going. And what I mean by that is you have to have the right resource to talk to. You need to identify the objects you want to do. You need to identify the policies that you want to really create. And that takes time. This is not a 8, 9, 10 week project. This is a years and years of project that you have to take the time, understand what you're trying to really lock down, and even make two considerations such as things such as, hey, what's the risk level? And to be very honest with you, you will not get everything all the time. There is no way. There's just not enough time. And there should be a time or a line in the sand where you're just like, you know what, this is what we're going to do in terms of locking things down. Everything else will adjust accordingly, which is convenient because people are busy. It takes a lot of time, it takes effort, it takes money and resources to really get it set up. So it takes a lot of time. So that's one of the biggest cons there. So if you have leadership who wants instant results, it's not the case here for ABAC. It's going to take some time. And once you get that initial setup, that's where you'll reap the rewards that comes of ABAC. The second thing I talked about a little earlier is you can't factor everything. It's just impossible. Just so many nuances, especially if you're a huge organization. If you're a big organization and you're trying to do this, it is mind-numbing how much time you take to get that done. It is not possible. You won't get results. Leadership, that, as we all know here in the business world, they want results fast. It's almost how Agile was born. But you cannot factor everything. So it's really a decision. What are we going to lock down? What's the standard? For example, privileged users, how much of privileged user are we going to lock down? And then we go from there. And let's start with this initial baseline first, and then we progress as we mature as an organization and we get much, much better of ABAC. That's when we can go factor in everything else. But really, you just can't do it from the get-go. You have to be very specific or it's never going to launch. You're going to sit there in strategy hell forever. And then the third part is, if you're a small business organization, ABAC really is not really the right approach for you. It takes time and effort, and being a small business, I get the understanding that you want to really get it and go. I feel like RBAC is more the better approach for you when it comes to that, because ABAC, just so many nuances. And I bet you probably don't have a lot of big things that you're really managing because you're a small business. And I'm not saying that's 100% true, but really feel like ABAC is more for enterprise level organizations versus small business organizations. Whew, that's a lot. So let's talk about the summary. So what do we learn here about ABAC? So the first thing we learn about ABAC is that it's fine-grained access control, where you can be very specific in how you lock things down, where in RBAC, you're creating a role that could have 80% of people get this. So I'm going to give it to them, and the 20%, I'm going to make it non-requestable, or they're going to request it themselves. But you just never know that you might get more access. And sometimes when you get that access to people, you might be giving them access to everything, where not particular databases or folders or directories, where in fine-grained access control or in ABAC, you can do that. Also, you can use several factors. So we talked about objects, we talked about the subject, we talked about the policies, we talked about the environmental control. 4 things that you can take into account in various different combinations to really make sure that you can grant access to there in terms of ABAC. And then, like I said earlier, it's better for enterprise organizations because it's scalable. You can take it and build upon it bigger and bigger and bigger with more policies, and that's really how it works. So ABAC in a nutshell is really better for bigger organizations to be more specific in how you want to grant access to things. And that's where we have it. And again, I didn't get into too much detail. I want to be very high level because seriously, this could be an hour-plus video, and you don't want to hear me talk for an hour plus. Trust me, you'll be like, forget this guy, we're done. So I want to be very specific, make it quick and short, and talk to you really about the difference between ABAC, RBAC, and what ABAC is from a nutshell. So there you have it. That's ABAC in a nutshell. And I really hope you got a good idea of what ABAC is and how that works for you. And in future videos, I'll talk more and more about different policies out there, different authorization methods. We have PBAC, we have DAC, discretionary access control, and we have some couple other ones right there in the pipeline too. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. If you liked everything that you heard today, leave me a comment down below. I read them all. I want to respond to every single one of them because I love to make these videos. And I want to make sure you're getting value from it. If you liked everything, again, subscribe, hit that like button, and you'll get notified for more videos. And as always, like I always tell you, everybody, as I always tell everybody, stay curious because you never know. I'll see you next time. Stay tuned. Stay tuned. Oh man, it's been a day.